Hey guys, another Saturday lecture for you. This one's on the cause of the American Revolution. And I did look at your textbook this morning and saw that there's a lot of really detailed and specific information in there. So remember that I'm kind of like your filter. So I'm trying to pull out the stuff that you really need to know. Now there's a lot of really good stuff in the textbook and you can always use that as like evidence, for instance, like specific evidence on an essay or something like that. But I think if you just kind of focus on what I have here, that I think that you guys will be okay. You'll have the really general but specific enough information that you need to know to get this stuff. All right, so let's go ahead and do it with the road to independence. So the first concept that we have to look at is salutary neglect. Now remember, the colonists had been pretty much developing on their own since day one. They've been able to develop their own political, social, economic institutions really without any direct interference from Britain. And this is important in this context because the colonists have the expectation then that they're always going to be able to continue to basically continue to develop on their own. So when things change then with the French and Indian War, when everything kind of gets flipped around, this is going to cause tensions to occur, which eventually is going to lead to the American Revolution. So remember, with the French and Indian War, Britain is now the dominant European power. The French are gone. And now the British are in the colonies. They're in the Americas permanently. They've got troops here. They have a lot of government officials here. And so they're going to be able to do a lot of the things that maybe they had wanted to do in the past. You know, a little bit more direct control over the colonial economies and their political institutions and whatnot. But there's a couple of key questions that Britain is asking itself, and that is, who's going to pay for all this? Because you guys know that wars cost money, and who is going to pay for the French and Indian War? Who's going to pay for the continued upkeep in defense of the Americas? You've got their British troops there, they need to be paid, so where are their salaries going to be coming from? Well, I think a lot of British officials, Parliament, the King, they're going to start to think, well, the colonists are the ones who are benefiting from this the most. They are part of the British Empire. They should be paying for the upkeep of their colonies. So because Britain has the ability now to directly run what is going on there, you will see this shift in colonial economic policy. And you'll see that Parliament will attempt to have more direct control. It really starts off with the proclamation line of 1763, if you guys remember this from the other day in class. I think this is important because this is really, I think, foreshadowing what is to come in the future. This is Britain's, really it's their first attempt at doing something directly in the colonies, and the colonists are going to react to this with contempt. They don't like it. Now, I think that Britain may have had a little bit more innocent intentions with this in terms of, well, let's try to keep the peace. Remember, after the French and Indian War, you had Pontiac's rebellion, and they wanted to prevent other things like that from happening. So they were kind of like, well, let's keep this as like an Indian reservation, and then colonists need to stay over here. Even though this is completely unenforceable, the idea that Britain's saying you have to stay here. These colonists have had their freedoms now for so long that they're not going to like it. Kind of liken it to, you guys right now, you move out on your own, you live in your own apartment, and everything's great. You decide when you want to eat, you decide when you want to get up in the morning, you decide whether or not you want to scrub the toilet. You have the freedom to basically decide how and when you want to do all of these things and what you want to do. And then, you live like that for, 3-4 years or whatever. And then all of a sudden, mom wants to move in with you. And then mom moves in with you and starts putting all these rules and restrictions on you. She's giving you curfews. She's saying you got to clean the toilet every Friday, and you got to do this and you got to do that. You got to think about how that would make you feel. Okay, I'm sure you probably wouldn't be jumping for joy. And of course, the colonists are not jumping for joy either. So really, I think the main significance of the French and Indian War is this idea of salutary neglect ending, and this complete redefinition of how Parliament is going to rule over the colonies. So instead of being more indirect, it's going to be direct rule of Parliament. And again, it's that loss of freedom that is going to cause tensions with the American colonists. You don't need to know who George Grenville was by name or anything, but it really kind of starts here where you have the king, you have the prime minister, you have many members of parliament, not everyone, but many members of parliament beginning to say that it's time for the colonists to begin to pay their way in the empire. At this point is, I think, key. British taxpayers are paying 5 times as much as the American colonists. How does that happen? That's a huge difference in what these people are paying. They're both part of the British Empire. And remember, the American colonists view themselves as British citizens, so why aren't they paying the same amount? And remember that Britain also is left in debt. It's pretty severe debt after the French and Indian War. So, where can you get money from? Well, of course, get them from the colonists. They should pay their way as part of the membership of the British Empire. So Grenville and Parliament are going to start to impose more rules and acts and taxes and stuff on the colonists, which they're not really going to like a whole lot, because again, to them it's a loss of their sovereignty and their freedom, and they believe that what Grenville and Parliament's doing, that it's violating their rights as British citizens. The Currency Act is not all that important, so I wouldn't worry about that. The Sugar Act, though, is really important. We talked about the Navigation Acts in the past. Basically, the Sugar Act just replaces the Molasses Act, which nobody paid any attention to at all. Again, we're looking at England really trying to ensure that the American colonists are getting their goods, in this case, sugar, molasses, that they're getting it from ships from Britain. That way they get all the revenue from that. So one of the ways that the colonists had continued to smuggle in their molasses from, like, the French West Indies was through bribery. They were paying off customs officers, giving them 1.5, 2 pences per gallon, to basically allow them to take these smuggled barrels of molasses into the Americas. So England basically just tells the customs duties, okay, well, if they're paying 1.5 to 2 pence, just charge them 3 pence. So it was a way kind of for Britain to say, okay, well, if you're going to continue to smuggle, then we're just going to up the bribe, so to speak. And the colonists weren't dumb. They knew what Britain was doing, and of course they're not going to support this because it's, again, Britain kind of like sticking a fork in them, so to speak. So they're going to try to continue to smuggle in and try to evade paying the 3 pence duty on the molasses. But the big thing that is going to come out of the Sugar Act, which is going to be an argument that we're going to see over and over again, is this stuff right here, that the colonists are going to say that this is unconstitutional. Now, Britain does not have a constitution like we have a constitution. They have like a whole bunch of documents that comprise what you would say was like British common law. So things like the English Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta. And in those documents, there are specific references in there that, especially this one right here was really focusing on, is that when you look at the idea of taxes, that taxes have to originate with the people, that you cannot have taxation without representation. So understand, and this is something that kids get confused sometimes, is that the colonists are not saying, you can't tax us. They're not saying that. They're saying essentially that if there's going to be taxes, it has to come from the local assemblies, which are chosen by the people. That is representation. So we've already looked at this idea. We've talked about this. If, again, in the colonies, we're looking at the House of Burgesses being able to do that, the town halls deciding to do this, and like New England, the local governments in the South being able to do this, but not Parliament, according to the columnists, because they don't have physical representation in there. Okay, we'll see Britain's going to say something that they kind of do have representation, and it's going to just be differing opinions, almost semantics. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is the main objection, the main argument that the colonists are going to use pretty much for all of these different taxes that we're going to be talking about. Also, since this is really the first big act, the big tax that's going to be imposed on the colonists, this point right here also, that they are upset at the growing administrative power of Britain. They're not used to it. With salutary neglect, the British didn't have the ability to be able to do these types of things and to actually like follow through with it. So the colonists are definitely resentful. It's a good word. They're very resentful over what is beginning to happen here. Another thing that the British did, and this is kind of in relation to the Sugar Act, is they issue what were called writs of assistance. You had like these British colonial officials whose job was to ensure that smuggling was not happening. So these British officials, what they were to do was they were issued these things called writs of assistance, these documents, and what it allowed them to do was it basically allowed them to go into anyone's warehouse, place of business, even their homes, because a lot of people did do business from their homes, and it allowed the British then to search. So searching people's warehouses, homes, whatever, and they're looking for illegal smuggled goods. Now the problem with this is that there's no search warrant whatsoever. They can go in whenever, wherever they want. There's nothing there specifically like a search warrant today that says you have to go to this specific spot. You can only look here. This is exactly what you're looking for, nothing else. Nothing like that. So people like James Otis, he was a lawyer and he thought this was a bunch of baloney. He thought that, again, that it went against English common law. He is going to argue that these writs of assistance need to end. Of course, they're not going to end, but you do have the colonists speaking out against these things. And what we see later is that after the American Revolution, every single state will create their own constitution. And one of the things that you see in every state constitution's Bill of Rights, because they all had a Bill of Rights as well, is they put in this clause in there that the government does not have the right to conduct unreasonable searches and seizures. Same thing when we finally create our real constitution, that the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which is also in the National Bill of Rights, that it also will be about this right here, that the government does not have the right to conduct unreasonable searches and seizures. So we're seeing how later our government is influenced by what is going on during this time. It's the same thing with the Quartering Act. So with the Quartering Act, what Britain is trying to do is to get the colonists basically again to pay for the upkeep of the colonies, that they're the ones who are going to be paying for the troops in the colonies. So the Quartering Act basically said that the colonists have to supply the troops that are there with food, munitions, and they also have to provide a place for them to be, so barracks. And there are a couple things about this are kind of, they don't, that the colonists don't like. One, they don't want to have to pay for these people, these soldiers, British soldiers, because remember I told you guys that the British, regardless if you were, an upper class aristocracy British guy or a soldier, whatever, that these people look down upon the American colonists as being like second-class citizens. So the fact that the Americans colonists were being forced to do this, it was kind of like a punch in the face almost. And the colonists really, really, really resented this. And again, when we look at influence later in our history, the Third Amendment to the National Bill of Rights, or in our Constitution, the Third Amendment is going to be the no quartering of troops. And oh, sorry, I forgot the second point. So the second point also that the colonists have a problem with, and why they don't want to do this up here, is because who is it that's enforcing all of these taxes that they don't want to pay? It's the troops. So again, a lot of resentment. They don't want to do it. This one's probably the most important one, especially when it comes to the idea of this development of colonial unity and identity within the colonies. So what Britain wanted to do is, again, they want to make some revenue so they can be able to pay the troops off. With this one, whenever you purchase some type of a paper product, it could be some type of a card. I don't have a card. I thought I had a card right here, but I don't. Let's say you buy a book. Oh, I got a really good book here. Hold on a second. Let's say you want to buy a book. Oh, who is that? Who is that? Alexander Hamilton. Yeah. I'm sure you all are going to run to the bookstore to buy this. It's only this thick. I think you could probably read that like right after you're done with the Enduring Vision. Yes. You buy books, you buy newspapers, you buy playing cards. You had to have one of these stamp things. It was a tax, essentially. So you had to pay a tax on these things. And it was everything, by the way. Like, you wanted to get married, you had to have one of these stamps on your marriage license. You had a business contract with somebody, you had to have a stamp. You die, on your death certificate, you had to pay a tax. Born free, tax to death, right? So anyways, you've got these colonists having to purchase these stamps, this tax, in order to purchase all these paper products. You know, and here's the thing: it's kind of different than, say, like the Sugar Act. Not everyone's really affected by the Sugar Act. If you really think about it, it's like, okay, well, you know, if you're a merchant, yeah, you're probably affected by that. If you drink a lot of rum, which molasses was made into, you know, maybe the rum was a little bit more expensive, whatever. But you know, most people aren't really going to feel that direct effect of the Sugar Act. But this, everyone is going to, you know, purchase a newspaper or a book or, you know, get married or die, whatever. And so everyone is going to have to really deal with this particular one, and you know, they don't really like it. To them, this is more of a, what you would call like an internal type of a tax. That, you know, it's not really dealing with imports, exports, and all that stuff out there or whatever. This is like directly dealing with the colonists. And to the colonists, again, they should have the ability to impose this type of a tax. Okay, so I guess Grenville probably said, look, you know, you guys need to do this. If you don't, we're going to do it. If you don't pay for the troops on it, we'll tax you. So that's kind of what the Stamp Act was about. You know, no colonial governing body is going to impose some type of a tax where the revenue is going to be going to the British troops. That just is not going to happen at all. So Britain goes ahead, they issue this thing. And what this does is, this is an important point, this last point right here, that it's really showing that Parliament has the power to levy an internal tax on the colonists. And this is really what the colonists are going to have an issue with. Again, they were kind of upset about the Sugar Act and everything. And by the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned this on that slide, but with the Sugar Act, like I said, it really only affected a small amount of people in Boston, a lot of merchants and things like that. But you know, again, this is going to affect lots and lots of people. And because of that, you're going to have a lot more resentment and anger towards the Stamp Act, because it's something that's almost universal that everyone is going to have to deal with. And again, to them, this is an issue of taxation without representation. None of their local assemblies, local governments came up with this. It was something that was being imposed upon them by Parliament. Stupid Parliament. What was the reaction? Well, the reaction was not all that great for the Americans, as you could guess. To the Americans, they thought that their rights as British citizens, that they were deliberately being taken away from them. I don't know, you might think it's kind of funny, but you know, people were actually like rioting out in the streets, and they were setting buildings on fire. And the tax collectors, man, I tell you what, that's one profession, and if you want to call it a profession, that's one job that I would not want to have during this time, as being a tax collector, because you've got these colonists that are just going to be going out there, they're going to be burning down their homes, and later we'll see that a lot of the British officials will be tarred and feathered and whatnot. So yeah, but anyways, going back to this, people actually like protested in the streets. They were rioting in the streets because they had to pay this tax. Um, I don't know if you can liken it to, I don't know if this is a good similarity or not, but you guys remember the Occupy movement that happened, what, a few years ago or so? You know, you've got all these people who are really angry about the wealthiest 1%, whatever, and you know, they're out rioting in the streets. In some cases, it got pretty bad. You know, I don't know if it's the same type of a comparison, but you know, people get riled up when it comes to this kind of stuff. And you know, what's significant about the Stamp Act is that you're going to have a call for an all-colony Congress. Now, I'm talking about this idea of colonial unity. So with the Stamp Act, it's going to provide that unity, and they're going to form a body that is going to deal with this situation, that is going to encompass all the different colonies within the Americas. And this is actually this thing right here, this it's a, I guess, a political cartoon. It was a poster, and that is actually from a time period. I think that's kind of cool. I always wanted that on a t-shirt, or a big old poster would be kind of cool. I don't know, I guess that's nerdy history teacher stuff. But you know what? I'm telling you, by the end of this class, you're going to be like nerdy A-push person. And you're going to join, you're going to be part of that cult, the cult of A-push. And you're going to want a t-shirt like this. Actually, you're all going to want a Alexander Hamilton t-shirt. Girls, you're going to want a poster of him on your wall. You just wait. You just wait. So one of the things that is going to happen in reaction to the Stamp Act is that you're going to have groups come together to deal with this situation. Again, you had a lot of public rioting and protests and things like that, and there needed to be something to kind of organize all of this because it was getting a little out of hand. So the Sons of Liberty is going to be a group that is going to pop up, and their main thing is to lead like more organized type protests. Okay, and they will do things like, you know, intimidating royal officials, like I mentioned, behead and burn in effigy various tax collectors. And what that is, I'm sure you guys have probably seen something like this before, like where you'll have like a dummy of somebody, so like you're really irritated because Lehman gives like these really freaking hard tests, and you're like really irritated. You're going to protest against how hard A-push is. So you're going to make a dummy of me out of, you know, like my inside is going to be hay and whatnot, and you're going to make sure you put an Alexander Hamilton t-shirt on me before you do this, okay? So you're going to create this dummy of me, and then you're gonna hang me from a tree, and you're gonna protest of how evil I am and how horrible I am, and then maybe you might even like behead me, my effigy, or burn me. Would that make you feel better? Nah. Anyways, so the Sons of Liberty then were there to try to organize all of this and to make a point that we don't like this tax, okay? And again, looking at who's largely part of this, again, we're not looking necessarily so much at the real lower class people. You know, who is really affected by this the most is going to be, especially with the Sugar Act, wealthy merchants, excuse me, from the Stamp Act, again, who's purchasing books and newspapers and things like that. You know, a lot of people are, but again, we're looking more so at your middle, upper class type people. Remember, I had told you guys before that when we're getting into the revolution, that the revolution is actually initiated more so from the gentry class, okay? Women also played a significant role in all of this. There was also a Daughters of Liberty group that popped up, and they're going to participate along with men in a lot of these protests and stuff. And we'll see that later, and I don't know if I'll bring them up again, but later they will protest or through boycotts, British goods. So two things that they're going to try to boycott the most to really hit Britain where it hurts the most: tea and textiles. So we'll see that women play a really significant role because they'll have their own what are called spinning bees, where they will try to construct as many clothes that they possibly can on their own so they don't have to purchase it from Britain. And then also tea, they will be big proponents of not purchasing British tea. And since mostly it's women who purchase and consume tea, that's pretty significant. So they played a really significant role. All right, this is leading up to the Stamp Act Congress, which is really important. So remember I said before that there was this body that was created as a colonial body that is going to have members from all the colonies, and then they're going to protest together. They're going to actually, the big thing that's going to come out of what they do is this right here, boycotts, okay? They don't like the Sugar Act, they don't like the Stamp Act, they think that their rights as British citizens are being violated, is going against British common law, and that they feel like they're being taxed without representation. So note here, they're seeking compromise. They're not looking at declaring independence or anything like that. They're trying to kind of tone things down a little bit. Although this dude over here, this is Patrick Henry. This guy was kind of nuts. He was known for these really like crazy, fiery speeches, and he's already talking about we're Americans and maybe we should break away, whatever, I don't know, but he was just crazy. Okay, well, I should say crazy for his time. He actually made a lot of sense if you actually read some of his stuff. Anyways, you have, someone really fiery like him. You've got all these people who are, burning in effigy these colonial tax collectors and whatnot. They're trying to tone things down a little bit and seem a little bit more reasonable about things. So their way of trying to deal with the situation, because ultimately their goal is to have the Stamp Act repealed. Okay, repealed, if you don't know what that means, it means take it away. We don't want it anymore. So we're looking at Parliament to repeal or get rid of the Stamp Act in particular. Okay, and so at this point here, they're imposing an economic boycott on England. And because England's in debt at the time, I mean, this is going to hurt them. And I think it's important because the colonists are going to learn, hey, look, this is something that works. So we can use it in the future if we have to, and they will. Eventually, the Stamp Act will be repealed, and you can view that as a win for the colonists. So yay, colonists. English law, I've already mentioned this a couple times, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but a central question, a philosophical question to consider is the second question first. Did the American colonists have the same rights as Englishmen in England? Is it any different? Are they actually British citizens? You've got different colonies that Britain has, like Scotland and Ireland and stuff, and the rules and laws with a lot of these different colonies are different. So where does America stand in all of this? Do they have the same rights as Englishmen in England? And then the first question that I have on here, did England have the right to tax the colonies even though they had no representation? Now I am saying they have no representation here, but the question really is, did they have representation? Okay, so did the colonists have representation? Did the colonists have the right to tax the colonies even though they don't physically have a person sitting in Parliament? And do the colonists have the same rights as Englishmen in England? So again, looking at a couple of major documents that comprise the idea of British common law and their constitution, the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, English Bill of Rights in particular, I mean, it states in there that you cannot have taxation without representation. So of course the colonists say, no, we do not have physical representation in Parliament, so therefore our representation are our local assemblies. That's it. And Britain's going to say, you guys are on crack, and you do have representation. You have what's called virtual representation. Parliament represents everybody in the English Empire, regardless of where you are. You don't have to have a physical body sitting in the halls of Parliament. No, you have virtual representation largely because you are a member of the British Empire, and Parliament represents everybody. Okay, so the patriots or the American colonists are going to kind of reject this whole idea, and they believe that Parliament was not superior to their local assemblies. That's what Parliament's going to say. That Parliament has ultimate rule over all of its colonies, and the American colonists are going to say that's not the case. That our local assemblies, our houses of burgesses, for instance, are on par with Parliament. They're equal. So you have a differing of opinion here. Now, after the Stamp Act was repealed, I think that, well, I mean, you can look at this in different ways, I guess, but I think that England wanted to kind of save face a little bit. So what they did is they passed what was called the Declaratory Act in 1766. So even though the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament wanted to say, look, we are superior to you and your local assemblies. So the Declaratory Act then, it reaffirmed Parliament's full power and authority to make laws for the colonies in all matters, and they are superior to their local governments. The colonists are going to be like, no, that's not how it is. So again, I think this was a little bit for England saving face, because I guess they were sort of kind of defeated a little bit after the repeal of the Stamp Act. Charles Townsend will become the Prime Minister of England in 1767, and he, just like most other prime ministers, are going to believe that the colonists are a bunch of crybabies. And you can believe that too, by the way. You look at what's going on, the fact that the colonists aren't paying as many taxes, that supposedly all of the people within the entire British Empire, that they're all represented by Parliament, and Parliament is, according to England, the top dog. They are the top authority when it comes to stuff. Is it that the colonists are just a bunch of crybabies and pay your freaking taxes? Or is it more? Is it more than that? Is it about constitutional natural rights? When we talked about how the Enlightenment played a really significant role in this, and John Locke's idea of natural rights, that people have the right to life, liberty, and property, and if the government's not taking care of those things, then you have the right to change that government. That's ultimately where we're going with this, by the way, if you haven't figured that one out by now. Anyways, going back to Charles Townsend. So this guy was just like most of the other British authorities. And by the way, there are some significant voices in Parliament that are on the side of the colonists. William Pitt was one. Edmund Burke is another one. So don't think that everyone was like anti-colonists. Anyways, for like the third time, Charles Townsend. Ugh. So he was not sympathetic towards the colonies. In fact, he wanted to squeeze more money out of the colonists. He supported the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and all these other things. And so he's looking for other ways to get revenue from America. He felt that they should be paying more. So this brings us to the very, very, very important Townsend Act. Obviously, I'm saying very 3 times. It's it's pretty important. So the Townsend Act is going to put duties or taxes on these items: paper, glass, paint, and tea. To be honest with you, the British government's not going to get a whole lot of money out of the paper, glass, and paint part of this. Tea, though, is going to be pretty significant. Now look at what the money is supposed to go to. This one's kind of funny, I think. So the revenue is to go for the salaries of the royal governors, whom the colonists hated. It was to go to the royal judges, whom the colonists hated, and it was to go to other officials, duties or customs officials and tax collectors and things like that, maybe soldiers. So this money then is going to people whom the colonists hate, and it's those people they think that are violating their rights, in addition to Parliament. So of course this is not going to sit well with the colonists at all. They believe that this undermines the autonomy, freedom, and authority of American political institutions. Again, it's that same argument that if there's going to be this type of a tax, that it has to come from their local political institutions, their local governments. So therefore, they believe that this is a tax that was imposed without consent of the colonists. So again, it's that same argument of taxation without representation. So look what they do. It really shouldn't shock you a whole lot. What worked for the Stamp Act? Boycotting. So they're going to do the same thing. They're going to boycott British goods, and they're going to impose this non-importation of British goods either. So they're going to refuse, and again, tea is going to be a big one here. They're going to refuse to purchase tea from the British as well. So non-importation, they're going to have a boycott of British goods. So eventually, the taxes on paper, glass, paint, and tea, those will be lifted. Or sorry, let me say that one more time. The duties on paper, glass, and paint will be lifted. And as I said before, it wasn't like they were getting a ton of money out of that anyways. But the tea tax they're going to keep. Okay, and maybe for one of two reasons. One, because that was the largest source of revenue out of these items that were being taxed. Secondly, I think that this was a way for Britain to stick it to the colonists and once again declare, you can't tell us what to do. We rule you. And if we want to have a tax on paper and we want to remove it, we will. If we want to have a tax on tea and keep it, we will. You do not dictate that. That was pretty intense, wasn't it? Not really, I know. I'm so lame. Anyways, so they kept that tax on tea, which I think maybe if you know the story here, you know where this is going to go. Lots of tensions in the colonies. In Boston, I think, is probably the city, as a Massachusetts, the colony as a whole, that probably had things the worst when it came to all these different taxes that were going on. Boston had some economic problems going on, where a lot of people were out of work, they didn't have jobs, and just things just got bad. A lot of a lot of merchants there, so a lot of the taxes are going to apply directly to them. So you had a lot of tensions between the British or the American colonists and the British that are there. And there are troops that are directly stationed in Boston. There's a heavy British presence in Boston. And there was a situation that happened where there was a protest. I think it was in front of, gosh, I can't remember. I think it was in front of maybe a tax collector's house or something like that. I can't remember the exact circumstances. But what ended up happening was that some British troops ended up firing on this crowd at this protest. And a kid was killed, like a 10, 11-year-old boy was killed. And that just really inflamed the city, like big time. And that's just going to cause tensions to even be worse. So in 1770, when you have what's known as the Boston Massacre happen, like I said, tensions had already been really, really high at the time. You know, one evening, you had a group of colonists led by a guy named Crispus Attucks, who was actually kind of interesting. He was a mix of Native American Indian and African American, so not a white guy. Anyways, you had this group that was marching through the streets, and they came upon some British soldiers. I think there were like 13 of them or so, and they started throwing rocks and bottles and stuff at the soldiers. Now, as the story goes, and again, I don't know the exact truth of what actually happened, but I guess they were throwing snowballs as well. So yeah, it's kind of funny that you have this situation potentially happening over the throwing of snowballs. Anyways, making a long story short, rocks are being thrown at the British troops, and someone trips or someone yelled fire. It's really fuzzy actually in terms of what actually happened. Nobody really knows. if the British troops were ordered to fire. I've heard stories that someone, like a colonist, actually yelled fire to get the British troops to fire at the colonists to create this situation. It's hard to say. Regardless, what ended up happening was that the the British soldiers are going to fire upon these unarmed colonists. And as a result of that, you had several of them being killed, including Crispus Attucks, by the way. So, this is something that, like I said, Boston was kind of at the center of all of this, and they had felt a lot of really, really negative effects of everything that had been going on, and they really wanted to get more colonies on board with all of this. So a guy named Paul Revere, maybe you've heard of him, is going to be hired to create this amazing piece of propaganda that you guys are looking at, and that's exactly what this was, propaganda. This political cartoon was created to stir the emotions of the American colonists. Excuse me. I mean, if you look at this thing, look at the soldiers here. They look like freaking zombies. Look at this guy right here. Okay, that guy creeps me out. Look, they're all white and they're kind of creepy looking, and this guy's like laughing. We're killing these guys. Right? So I mean, that's crazy. And then here you have all the people like, oh my God, they're all dying on the floor, like, oh, poor, woe was me. And there's the dog. Where's with the dog again? We go from the Salem witch trials and then killing a dog because they think a dog is a witch. So this poor little dog. I don't know if the dog got shot here. We'll just say that he was. It sounds better. Anyways, so they call this thing up here the Bloody Massacre, or what's known as the Boston Massacre. Okay, like, I think 6 people died. Massacre. Is that really a massacre? That's like, I don't know. I don't know if that's really a massacre. I mean, it was like maybe the Boston shooting or something like that, but to call it the Boston Massacre, I mean, it was definitely, that word was used on purpose, because you think massacre and you're like, oh my God, that's like some serious stuff. So this piece of propaganda, this political cartoon, it will be shown throughout all the colonies, and it's the Bloody Massacre, the Boston Massacre. And so people in Rhode Island, people in Virginia, people in North Carolina and Georgia, they're like, what the heck is going on in Boston? What is happening? So propaganda, something like this is it's really powerful stuff. It totally blows this whole situation out of proportion. Okay, I'm really sorry for the like 5 or 6 people that were killed as a result of this, but I mean, it really is not a massacre, so to speak. And as a side note, by the way, John Adams, who is a founding father and a patriot, actually defended these British troops, and most of them ended up getting off. I mean, again, there's no real proof in terms of exactly what happened here. And John Adams was appalled that you had this mob of people basically, ganging up on the soldiers, on the British soldiers. So, by the way, John Adams took a lot of criticism for that as well. The committees of correspondence, this dude right here, this Sam Adams, John Adams' brother, he was a failed brewer. Anyways, one of the things that he is going to organize was called the committees of correspondence. And the main goal of the committees of correspondence is to take like this kind of stuff, the propaganda, and to spread it all throughout the colonies. And this is going to be, I mean, you think about communications during this time, there is no internet, there is no telephones or anything like that. So they have this whole organization network where they're able to get the same information from point A to point B to point C to point D. And so everyone then is like, okay, this is what's going on. And everyone understands, has the same frame of reference, so to speak. So it's a way to spread that anti-British propaganda and to get everybody on board. And eventually all the colonial governments had these committees of correspondence. And so I think it's important because everyone has the same information. Everyone knows what's going on in Boston. Everyone is going to be knowing what's going on all over the colonies. So helping to bring them together. So I talked about how the tea tax was actually kept as part of those Townsend duties. Now, tea is like kind of a significant thing in British culture. If you know anything about it, I don't know what time's like noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever, and you have tea time where you have all of the British citizens like stop what they're doing and they get their little tea and their little biscuits, which are freaking cookies. They get their little biscuits and then they drink their tea and they eat their cookies and I don't know what else they do. They talk or they go to sleep. I don't know what they do, but it's tea time. And everybody does tea time. My point here, other than being really annoying, is that tea is part of the British culture. So lots and lots of American colonists as British citizens are drinking tea. And again, I think it's one of the reasons why the tea tax was actually kept, because so many people drink it, and it'd be a big source of revenue for the British. Are always trying to find more revenue. So remember, colonists, they don't want to buy their tea from the British, so they're trying to smuggle it in again from other places, like the Dutch, for instance. The British East India Company, that's what the BEIC is. The British East India Company, they basically are going to have this monopoly on the tea trade in the Americas. So at one point, it was more expensive to purchase your tea from the British because they had a monopoly. They could basically charge whatever they wanted to. However, again, colonists keep smuggling the stuff in from other countries. So what Britain is basically going to do is that they're going to kind of like try to cut out, you know, they're going to try to get rid of all of the smuggling by lowering their price of their tea so low that it doesn't make sense for you to purchase your tea from somebody else. That way, again, they're kind of sticking it to the colonists. They're saying, well, our tea is the cheapest, so buy ours. So it's kind of like, because as a consumer, what are you going to buy? Are you going to buy the $5 box of Tazo tea? Are you going to buy the 50-cent box of Walmart tea? Well, I'm going to buy the Tazo personally. But most consumers are going to purchase the 50-cent Walmart tea. So it kind of forces then, because a lot of the colonists are purchasing the British tea, kind of forces them to end up paying that Townsend tax, where it was like, ugh, don't do that. So again, this is where you have like a lot of women and the Daughters of Liberty saying, don't, even though it's cheaper, don't buy it. And you've got a lot of resistance going on, bonfires and whatever, trying to prevent British ships from actually docking at American ports to prevent the British from getting their tea to the colonists. Which, of course, then is going to lead us to the Boston Tea Party. So the British are able to continue to bring in their tea to all of these harbors and ports and whatnot. And in Boston, the people were kind of like just fed up with it all. So you had these boats, these British boats that had tea on them out in the harbor, and you had a group of people that were part of the Sons of Liberty. They dressed up as Indians, and it was actually a sign of reverence, actually. They dressed up as Indians, they got out in the canoes, and they paddled on out to the ships, and they're going to dump all of this British tea into the harbor. And there were a lot of people that knew this was going to happen, so you had like all these people on the docks watching all of this, and I guess it was like just silent, and all you could hear was them like cutting open the boxes and dumping them into the water and whatnot. It's pretty intense, from everything that I read. So the colonists think this is like the greatest thing since sliced bread. They're like, look what we did, and of course Britain's like, they're just infuriated that the colonists are going to do something like that. And the dollar value, I don't remember where I got this from, but you look at the dollar value today at $800,000. It's almost $1 million. And for that time period, that's like a lot of money. So no, Britain was not dancing in the streets. They were extremely, extremely pissed off. So what they ended up doing is that they're going to pass what's known as the Coercive Acts of 1774. So you need to highlight that for sure. The Coercive Acts are really important. So there are like 4 different points to this this act. And understand, this is all about Boston. This was to specifically punish Boston for what they had done to their tea. So you have the Port Bill that closed Boston Harbor. That's going to hurt the Boston economy big time. You have the Government Act, which annulled the Massachusetts charter, and he took it away. So they lost their charter, royal colony, and now also, I think it says prohibited town hall meetings, but I think they were allowed to have one a year. But in essence, they took away that right from the colonists. You have a New Quartering Act, where the colony, I should say, must build barracks. That wasn't an option, had to do it. And then the Justice Act. What this was is, I think your book said that the colonists called this the Murder Act. That if you are a British official and you kill or murder a colonist, that your trial will be held in England. And of course, the reason for that is that if your trial is going to be held here in the Americas, where most likely you may have an American colonist judge or American colonist jury, you're probably going to be found guilty. But just about any British official in England is going to be found not guilty. So again, that was kind of like a stick it to you to the British, or to the people of Boston. So the Coercive Acts. Of course, the reaction of the colonists to the Coercive Acts was not a good one. You should know that the colonists, they call the Coercive Acts the Intolerable Acts. So this could be interchangeable, okay? Coercive Acts, Intolerable Acts, it's the same thing. It's just the British called them the Coercive Acts, the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. What Boston's going to want to do, and other colonies are going to want to help out with this as well, is they're trying to rally support for Massachusetts. And look at the quote from George Washington. The cause of Boston will ever be considered the cause of America. That is really telling of where the colonies are at this point in time, with that conception of American unity and American identity, that this is a common cause. You know, this is not the Virginians doing their thing, the Bostonians doing their thing, and the Georgians doing their thing. This affects what's going on in Boston. It could affect the entire colonies. It could happen anywhere. If Parliament is going to pass that type of a law on Boston, it could pass it on Charleston. It could pass it on Philadelphia. So Washington, as others, are astute in the idea that they see that this is an American issue. This is not just Boston or Massachusetts, okay? And then with the committees of correspondence, with what Sam Adams was doing, they're going to be spreading, again, their anti-British propaganda all throughout the colonies and trying to get that unity that they need to fight this thing together, because that's what they need to do. It's the only thing that's going to work, really. Going with the Coercive Acts, Britain also passed what was called the Quebec Act, which for the Americas is not totally like super important, but what Britain's going to do with Quebec is look at some of the things. You can worship Catholicism if you want, but and you may think it's a positive thing, but remember, the vast majority of American colonists are Protestant. No representative assemblies. That was so important to the colonists. No trial by jury in civil cases. So the point here is not so much, okay, this has happened in Quebec. It's, again, if the British are going to do something like that in Quebec, it could happen in the colonies as well. And especially, you know, these two things, you know, taking away the representative assemblies, taking away trial by jury. I mean, that scared the colonists. Got a few more slides here, guys. So after the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, were passed, the colonists believed it was like, I mean, time. They had to come together. They had to figure out what the heck they were going to do. So in 1774, a meeting was called in Philadelphia, and this would be called the First Continental Congress. And you absolutely need to know the First and Second Continental Congress. Okay, important. We're not at independence yet, guys. That's a really important point. We're getting there. Okay, it's 1774. We're so close to declaring independence, but the vast majority of colonists still consider themselves British citizens and are not willing to give that up. And look at how each of the regions is perceiving this situation. Okay, point of view. You get documents in a DBQ or something that is going to be talking about, declaring independence. You've got to understand that the various regions are going to have a different perspective on things. New England, they are going to be the most radical. Okay, they're the ones that are looking for the idea of a political union. That's breaking away. Okay, and even preparing for military defense. So they see the increasing amount of British troops that are coming into the colonies, and they believe they have to match that. Okay, so they're going to be the most radical, but that makes sense. You look at where a lot of this stuff is happening, it's happening in Boston. So it makes sense that you would have them being the most radical. On the other hand, the more conservative would be the Southerners. Okay, the Southerners were a little bit more, again, they're a lot more aristocratic, remember, there are a lot more ties to England. They're not even considering really any of this stuff at this point in time that New England's talking about. But they understand that there's a problem going on and that something has to be done. So in their eyes, that economic boycott, you should do that. It's worked. It's worked twice. It worked with the Stamp Act. It worked somewhat with the Townsend Act. So that's what needs to happen. And of course, the middle colonies are somewhere in the middle. They're going to seek compromise of some sort. Okay. I think, almost by this time, you have a lot of people in New England, especially in Massachusetts, John Adams is one of them, that thinks that it's time. It's time to break away and declare independence. So again, different perspectives. A name to remember for this, I probably have him on the Second Continental Congress slide, John Dickinson. John Dickinson is an important guy to remember for the middle colonies. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. So what the First Continental Congress is going to do, that you need to remember, is the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Okay? The Declaration of Rights and Grievances, basically what that is the colonists declaring their rights as British citizens, and they're stating what their grievances are, or what they perceive as the violations of their rights. Okay? These are their problems that they have. So Declaration of Rights and Grievances. So what they're demanding happen. They're telling the king, look, or Parliament, I should say, they're telling Parliament, you need to get rid of the coercive acts, and you need to reject that premise of a declaratory act. So that idea that Parliament trumps the local assemblies, you need to get rid of that. Until you do this, we're going to do this. Really important. Non-importation, non-exportation, non-consumption. And that's really going along with what the Southerners were looking at, an economic boycott. So we're not going to import anything from Britain. We're not going to import anything from Britain. We're not going to export anything to Britain. We're not going to consume anything that's British. That is like a major stab in the heart of Britain. And what the colonists also did is they established this thing called the Association. The association, its main purpose was to enforce this, the non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption. Okay. Also, the colonies are going to declare autonomy. They really want to go back to salutary neglect and economic warfare through the non-importation, non-exportation, non-consumption. And they decide, okay, well, we're going to wait. Let's wait and see what's going to happen. Let's see what Parliament's going to say when they give us a response. So while they're waiting, the American Revolution starts. So in essence, you don't really need to know a whole lot about this. In essence, Thomas Gage, actually, this came as a result of the Coercive Acts, was placed in charge. He was like the governor of Massachusetts. He is going to be directed by Britain to take into custody colonial leaders and to get a hold of any weapons or anything like that, take them away from the colonists. So most of the colonial leaders had left because they knew, well, they were in Philadelphia for one, and then secondly because they knew that they didn't want to be seen. Okay. So what Thomas Gage is going to do is that he's going to go into Concord, where he knew that there was like a garrison of weapons that the colonists had massed together. So he marches through Concord and is able to continue to move on. There's a little bit of skirmish there. And then he's going to continue on to Lexington, where the British are going to, the British are ambushed and completely caught off guard by the more like guerrilla type tactics of the American troops. You had, remember, this is all like, remember Paul Revere and the British are coming, all that. That's this particular thing. Anyways, so in essence, then, when you have the first shots at Concord and Lexington, this really is what starts the whole military aspect of the American Revolution. So the Continental Congress then reconvenes in 1775, and when they're together, you've got a big battle between the British and the colonists at Breed's Hill, or Bunker Hill. It's actually Breed's Hill. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. I don't know how they got that wrong, but whatever. So 3,000 British troops attacked Patriots on Breed's Hill. The British actually lost way more troops than the Patriots did in this, but John Adams and others were like, we need like a disciplined, trained army. We can't just rely upon these local militias and whatnot. So John Adams is pushing for a Continental Army, which will be given, which will get set up, and George Washington will be the leader of the Continental Army. But again, understand, even though the military aspect has started, the revolution has started, that still most people were like, we're British citizens, we still want to work this out and whatever. So here's good old John Dickinson. Remember we talked about him from the Middle Colonies from Pennsylvania. So John Dickinson is going to put together kind of like a last-ditch effort. It's called the Olive Branch Petition. With the Olive Branch Petition, basically, again, it's a last-ditch effort at peace. Let's work this out type of a thing. So that's going to get sent off to England. Let's work it out. Let's hold hands and sing. Kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya. All right. So that gets sent off to England. All right. And then Adams, again, he's one of the most, I think, one of the most radical of the members of the Continental Congress. He is going to ask for a Declaration of Independence to be drawn. People were like, oh my God, we can't do this. But he was given permission to go ahead and do that if it came to the point we actually needed, or they actually needed to declare independence. So what happens with the Olive Branch Petition? So good old Georgie the Porgy in England gets the Olive Branch Petition, and basically his response was, screw these people. They're in a state of rebellion, they're traitors, and if they are caught, they will be executed. They'll be hanged. Okay, and we are going to go to war with you, and we're going to basically put you in your place. We're going to put a naval blockade against all the colonies, so now you can't trade. So the response of the king, I don't think, was quite what John Dickinson and others had hoped for. At this point, there's really no turning back. So as I mentioned, before the Olive Branch Petition was sent out, the committee to put together a Declaration of Independence was put together, and the three guys that were in charge of that were John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. So they put together this declaration, went through many drafts, by the way. Jefferson wrote it, and both Franklin and Adams are going to rewrite portions of it. Jefferson's document was much more radical, and especially Franklin really wanted to kind of take the rough edges out of it, especially things dealing with slavery and whatnot. Anyways, so you're beginning to have more support, okay, for this idea of potentially declaring independence, but it was still something that most people, like common people, just really couldn't put their hands on. So that's where Thomas Paine is going to come in. Thomas Paine was actually a British citizen, and he came to the United States, or to the America, sorry, and he was like, he couldn't understand why the American colonists hadn't already broken away. He was like, gosh, I mean, not just Parliament, not just like the king, or look at both Parliament and the king are like, they're ludicrous, they're absolutely ridiculous in how they are trying to rule over you. So this pamphlet he wrote is called Common Sense. It was actually written in like common day language that basically everyone could understand, and he criticized the king, the whole idea of a monarchical style of government. He criticized Parliament, and he basically put out this, what most people considered a basic logical argument that made sense to a lot of people. And this pamphlet was like a bestseller. I mean, people read it and they were like, yeah, I get it. So after people read Common Sense and they really started thinking about it, people were ready. Most historians will say that it's this document that's going to kind of really, those people who are like sitting on the fence whether we should or should not declare independence, is this particular document that is going to put most people in favor of actually declaring independence. And that's pretty much what's going to happen. So I think that, I will give you guys an assignment on Common Sense. I'll probably give it to you guys on Monday. It'll be like a primary source type of a thing. And I'll have you guys look at that, and hopefully you'll be able to see, look at his exact arguments. And some of them are pretty basic, like, how is it that you have an island ruling a continent? It just doesn't make sense. So, by the way, it's not the greatest argument that he has, but it's one of them. It's kind of like, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense a little bit. Anyways, so I'll give you that assignment next time I see you, and signing off. This is a long one, obviously, and like I said, hopefully you split this up into 2 individual segments so you didn't go too crazy. I'm going to sign off with this again, just in case you didn't get a good enough look. There you go. Yeah, yaba. Alright guys, have a lovely day, evening, whatever. Enjoy. Hasta.